Hello. Hi, I'm Pooja, a type designer and an occasional researcher. Thank you so much for having me here. This is my second type weekend. Last year I was here with my friend Tanya George talking about type walks, and I couldn't be more excited to have the opportunity to talk about something else that's been on my mind for many years. I will be talking today about lithographed books produced by Indian printers in the 19th century in the region in and around the North Indian city of Lucknow. How did they come to be produced? What did they look like? And in the process, I hope to show you how books produced through lithography and in continuation of local manuscript cultures offer us a fresh way of looking at book design. To start at the very beginning, what do you think of if I ask you to imagine a book? Is it a particular shape and proportion? A classic paperback like Penguin perhaps? Or maybe a hardback? Do you imagine a front and back cover, even some end papers? And what about within? Is it mostly text? Does it have a few images sprinkled in? I suspect both images and text are laid out in familiar, almost expected layouts and orientations. And yet, all books don't look like that today. Take comics for instance. And all books certainly did not look like that in the past. There was a time, in our case in 19th century India, that the book that I just described, let's call that the Western book, was an altogether unfamiliar object. If a book is merely a storehouse of information, then the thing closest to it that the local populations were familiar with, it was the palm leaf manuscript. What was the palm leaf manuscript like? It contained individual folios held together between two wooden boards that served as covers. Now, each of these folios had a hole, and a string or a cord ran through them, and that wrapped around the entire book. The text was handwritten. It was aligned to the longer edge of the folio. The books didn't have any title page as we understand it, nor did they have pagination. In fact, if you really look at it, it didn't have a lot of similarities with the Western book as we are familiar with today. My concern today is the 19th century and a small fragment of the story of how we got from the palm leaf manuscript to the Western book in North India, the part of the world that I call home. Somewhere between these two well-known extremes on this spectrum lay a book that was produced indigenously and using the technique of lithography. These books have been called mass-produced manuscripts, but they were in fact something much more, a melting pot if you will. But before we dive right in, let's start with lithography. What is it, and why in the 19th century was it being used to produce books in North India instead of letterpress and movable type? Lithography, if you don't know, is a technique of printing that is based on the fact that oil and water don't mix with each other. On a flat stone, the areas that have to be printed are covered in oil or grease, while the non-printing area is kept wet with water. Because the ink is attracted to oil and not to the water, it only sticks to the greasy areas. After ink is applied to the stone, a paper is placed on it, pressed, and you have a print. Lithography was invented in 1796 by a German actor and playwright. He needed a cheap method for publishing plays, and lithography was his answer. In the years after its invention, it gained popularity for printing maps among other uses, and due to this, it made its way to India. The year was 1822, and the Surveyor General of India, who headed the effort for cartography in the country, suggested that lithography be introduced for faster production of government maps. His reason? The other widespread technique for making maps, copper plate engraving, simply wasn't advanced enough in the country. As luck would have it, his request coincided with the journey of one Major James Nathaniel Rhind to Calcutta. Rhind had learned about lithography in Edinburgh before he travelled to Calcutta, and he was already on his way with a lithographic press. On his arrival, Rhind proposed setting up a press for the government, and in 1823 he set up the Government Lithographic Press in Calcutta. And so, a mere quarter of a century after its invention, lithography made its presence felt in India. Now, this would be a good moment to talk about what made lithography so different from letterpress. The obvious difference, of course, is that while letterpress uses metal type, a fixed numbers of letters, numerals, symbols, what have you, to compose text, lithography can reproduce any text that is written as long as someone could reproduce it in inverse on a flat stone. This also means that in lithography, text could be laid out in all sorts of orientations and could be combined with images in any way one wanted. Both these factors were big advantages in mapmaking, but also fundamentally at odds with the rigid production process of letterpress. Now, if we were to stretch our imaginations a little bit more, we can also see how lithography would be a great method for printing texts in so-called complex scripts. These scripts inherently defy movable type's requirement of boiling down all written language to a finite number of shapes, a limited character set that can create all text. If you have designed a typeface in an Indic script, say Devanagari, you'll know what I'm talking about. The character set we choose to support in a font has a direct bearing on what words can be rendered beautifully. Take, for example, the word Luxembourg in the typeface Cambay, and you can see that this is a word that simply can't be rendered well because of the character set that has been ascribed to this font. Contrast this with lettering and calligraphy, which is what lithography really reproduces. And in that case, the designer or the writer can use their skill to elegantly combine any combination of half letters and matras that a word needs. Now, not just one script. Lithography could be used to produce multiple scripts on the same page. No additional material investment required. The only thing, once again, that was needed was a person who could write all the scripts you needed in reverse on the stone. Like us today, the British printing establishment, whether at home or in India, realized the advantages of using lithography for multiscriptural text. In 1824, Major Rhine's government lithographic press produced its very first book that contained lithographed text in both Devanagari and Nastaliq scripts. Now, after lithography was introduced in India, in Calcutta in 1823, it began to spread very quickly to other major cities in the country, to Bombay, Pune, Patna and Kanpur, and presses were soon owned by Indian printers. It was a kind of runaway success that letterpress hadn't been in the region. The political and legal situation in this part of the country offers us some reasons why. Now, just to remind you, India was colonized not by one but several European nations. Each had their own piece of the pie and their own rules and regulations about how to run it. Until 1813, when the Charter Act was enforced, the British East India Company prohibited all missionary activity on its territories because of its very strong policy of religious non-interference. North India, where we are today in this talk, was territory colonized by the British. The famous Serampore mission press, some of you will recall, was not in fact in Calcutta, but some kilometers away in Serampore, which was a Danish and not a British territory. The Serampore press produced scores of Devanagari fonts and published Bibles and tracts, but so far its influence was diluted in North India because of sheer distance. Things for printing in this part of the country were also helped along by the Metcalfe Act, which was passed in 1835. It paved the way for indigenous press ownership by repealing a decade-old ordinance that made owning a press without a license a penal offense. The first commercial lithographic venture in India was the Asiatic Lithographic Press, which was also set up in Calcutta the same year as Rhine's government press. It wasn't indigenously owned though. The press was owned by one Thomas Black, who was an assistant at the government facility. His commercial venture was a big success, and 7 years later, in 1830, he expanded his business into North India and opened a new branch in Kanpur. The king of Awadh, Nasiruddin Haider, invited the superintendent of this Kanpur branch of the Asiatic Press to move his establishment to the king's capital city, Lucknow. The superintendent complied, and so in 1830, the very first indigenously owned press, lithographic press, appeared in North India under the name of the King of Awadh. This encouraged others in Awadh to set up lithographic presses, and by the 1850s, Lucknow boasted of about a dozen establishments, owned and run by Indian printers. An Austrian Orientalist who was tasked with surveying the royal libraries in Lucknow in the late 1840s estimated that 700 books were lithographed in Lucknow and Kanpur alone before the end of 1849. By the early 50s, in 1853 for example, the Mustafai press was printing titles like Kissa Mansoor Shah and Laila Majnu in editions of over 1,000. So what did these lithographed books look like? One distinctive feature of the books produced in Lucknow was their title page. This page had a broad ornamental border which enclosed a rectangular space within, and this space was divided into horizontal panels. The central panel contained the name of the book, and the rest of them contained things like religious invocations or bibliographic data, which could be in the form of subtitles, the name of the editor or the author, or other kinds of printing information. The title page you see on the slide here is from the Sikandar Nama of Nazami Ganjavi, printed by the Hosseini Press in Lucknow in 1843. As you can see, this is deeply and satisfyingly decorative. Nothing at all about it screams minimal. This style first emerged in Lucknow for Persian and Urdu books, but soon became the de facto way to style a lithographed title page in the second half of the 19th century. It didn't matter what the language and script of the book was. Take this example of a Devanagari book published in Delhi in 1880. The ornamental border still persists, though now the central panel has been taken up by an illustration. The top panel contains the title, and the lower one contains bibliographic information. What also must be noticed in this cover is how easily text in both the Devanagari and Nastaliq scripts has been introduced right within the image. The popularity of these Lucknow-style lithographed books was such that they even became the template for the covers of books published by the very famous Naval Kishore Press. Established in 1858 in Lucknow, Naval Kishore Press was the largest Indian-owned printing press and publishing house in the subcontinent at the time. Now, the interplay of scripts and images that you saw in this cover wasn't just limited to the title page. Look, for instance, at this book published in Bulandshahr in 1882. The last page shows us how pagination was happening simultaneously in two types of numerals. The image at the bottom, an illustration, comfortably sits within the frame of the page with no explicit border to separate it from the text. In fact, if you can ignore that British Museum stamp in the middle of the page, you can see how the text was laid out in an inverted triangle and very beautifully flows into the empty space created by the two figures facing each other. What is very interesting for me here, and you can see it more clearly in this example from a book published in 1875 in Delhi, is that while Hindi books adopted the Sanskrit manuscript way of including bibliographic information at the end of a text, as opposed to at the beginning, which is what we are used to today, they borrowed the inverted triangle, a device from Persian manuscript tradition, to actually lay them out. Lithography also made other visual devices easy to employ. It opened up, for the lack of a better word, graphic design possibilities that were not possible using the letterpress just as easily. White text could be produced easily on a black or an illustrated background. An early example of this effect being put to use can be seen in the Mustafai Press's 1843 edition of Mir Aman Dehelvi's Bago Bahar. The visual effect was special enough for the volume's editor to actually mention it in his introduction to the book. He wrote, "The print is lovely, beyond praise. The title page is in white letters, so different from early editions." This visual effect remained in use throughout the course of the 19th century. Here's a later example from 1881, this time from a Devanagari book printed in Lucknow. Similar in design for the title page, though not as elegantly executed as the Bago Bahar. Lithography also allowed non-linear configurations of text that would be very, very difficult to produce in movable type. Calligrams, for one, which had been very popular in calligraphy, could be reproduced in lithography. In the title page of this book, called the Chistan, printed by the Mohammadi Press in Lucknow in 1839, the name of the author is only presented in the form of a 6-petal flower. Neither picture nor text. A calligram broke away from this dichotomy that a letterpress book so strongly enforces. Less dramatic but equally interesting is that lithography offered the opportunity to use different sizes of text with their baselines, or rather in this particular case their headlines, oriented at different angles. Not to mention the appearance of letterforms themselves. Lithography could produce the cascading letters of Nastaliq, and Devanagari letterforms could be strong and not emaciated looking like their metal counterparts. As typographers and book designers, I believe we must look beyond how books were produced using letterpress. Letterpress imposed physical limitations that dictated how book design would look. Lithography, on the other hand, did not have the same limitations. Lithography was cost-effective and it didn't require the same material costs. In 19th century North India, it encouraged indigenous printers to not only set up shop, but also produce books in local scripts, often in multilingual editions, and these books received lavish praise. On seeing books printed in Lucknow, people would open their eyes wide and be drawn to them like moths to a candle, wrote Abdul Halim Sharar in his retelling of his father's uncle's account of Lucknow's book trade. There is something I believe to be said in trying to learn about what kinds of books people produced for themselves, results of slow cultural assimilation rather than sudden imposition. Lithographic books from in and around Lucknow are a good example. They had a brief heyday and their numbers declined by the turn of the century, but I think they can still capture our imagination. And I hope that my little presentation whetted your appetite and offered you a new way to look at how we may design books today, when the limitations of letterpress don't always constrain us. Thank you so much for listening, and see you all on the internet.